Hi everyone, welcome back to a brand new session in a brand new unit in our tour through the Dead Sea Scrolls. Just kind of looking back to see where we've come from, we spent our first week setting the stage, getting a sense of the historical period, the big movers and shakers of Second Temple Judaism. And then last week what we were focusing in on was this question of who lived at Qumran, who penned and preserved these scrolls, and can we learn something internally from their own literature in the scrolls, from the archaeology as well? And then how do those things match up, and what tensions do we find with other descriptions of major ancient Jewish groups by writers like Philo, Josephus, and the like? Now we're turning a corner. We're looking at a different set of literature in the Dead Sea Scrolls that for me is one of the most exciting and interesting pieces of the puzzle to consider. Now we're going to look at the biblical scrolls. Those biblical scrolls that are foundational for the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible. And this unit that we're going to be looking at in this session and then in one session after this, I'm calling this the background of the Bible and the Bible rewritten. So in our session here today, we're going to be looking at a handful of biblical scrolls. And the question we're going to be looking at is, what do the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us about this biography of the Bible? I think what we're going to see is that the scrolls are invaluable. They at once challenge some of the things we might think to be true or hold dear to our hearts today about the Bible, but they also confirm some amazing things about the story of the biblical text that has come down to us today, some 2,000 years after the fact from this period that we're studying. One thing we want to remind ourselves from the get-go is that the Bible didn't just fall from the sky, that the Bible as a collection took a long process. It was a developmental process of composition, of transmission, and then eventually canonization. And that process involved human beings, and human beings participated in a way in updating, extending, collecting, preserving texts. So the Dead Sea Scrolls give us a great window not into just texts, but some of those human beings in that ancient Jewish community of Qumran that took part in this. I think what we're going to see here is that this unit we're focusing on texts, but also interpretation of biblical texts. So this is kind of part one, that text-centric question, where we're going to be focusing in on the biblical texts we find at Qumran and what we can learn from them. So our game plan for today is going to look something like this. We're going to look at 4 different areas that hopefully flesh out our understanding of what the biblical text looks like in ancient Judaism, specifically through the lens of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So thing number one I want to look at, item number one, is I want to just talk about this one deceptively simple term, Bible. I think that this term signifies certain things in our own day in Western culture, but this terminology has some different connotations when we look back in time. And we look back in time to this era of the Second Temple period. We want to ask, what does this term mean? Should we use it or should we use other terms? So that'll be the first item on the list, is just a simple question of terminology. The second thing I want to look at is 3 main textual traditions. By the time the Dead Sea Scrolls emerge on the scene in the late 1940s, early 50s, before that, for the last even few hundred years, there had been other discoveries and research that had been taking place on major textual traditions. So what are the conversation partners in other biblical traditions we want to know about that we can then draw into a conversation with the scroll? So that'll be what we'll be doing next. Once we've met some of those major biblical manuscript traditions, how do we explain them? The third thing we'll do today is we'll look at some major, again, 3 major theories that try to account for the differences in the development and the transmission of those main traditions that we can then compare with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then lastly, we've been talking theory, texts. I want to try to root this in some examples from Qumran, because the great thing, again, about the Dead Sea Scrolls is we don't have to just talk theory. We can actually measure and gauge some differences in texts themselves. And I want to share just a few examples that reflect some of the things we hear about in those theories that we'll be getting at in a minute. So Bible, text traditions, theories, examples, that's where we're going to be heading for this next stretch of our time together. All right, so you may have heard this word, and you've probably seen this book, Bible. Maybe you're familiar with seeing that word Bible in gold embossed letters on the front of a black leather-bound book or something alike. But this term we want to spend some time just pausing and reflecting on, because it means something very important in our own day, but that understanding might not be the same as in the ancient world. And I want to look at this, because the word Bible simply means book. It comes from the Greek word meaning biblos, but I think today it not only signifies book, as in any old book. The term Bible means the book. It means the book that is held to be authoritative, perhaps even inspired, definitely useful for instruction and life and living. And that is a a claim that's made by different faith groups today, whether it's Jews or whether it's Christians, whether that means Protestants, whether that means Catholics or Orthodox. What we have is at least 4 major strands of Western culture and Judeo-Christian culture that would say, yes, we have a Bible, and here's our authoritative book, our authoritative list of writings that we would say are unique to our own community. Now, by virtue of saying that and recognizing already that there are a number of different groups that have a number of different Bibles, the process that we call canonization involved exclusive and inclusive decisions. So you have a list of texts, and that list means some are in and others are out. If you were to walk into a bookstore today and you were to pick up a Bible, for example, a Hebrew Bible, you would see that those books are the same books you find in the Christian Old Testament, but the order is different. If you were to pull another volume off the shelf, and maybe this was a Catholic Bible or a study Bible like the one you might often have for courses at university, you'd probably find that you, again, have the Old Testament and the New Testament, but also the Apocrypha. If you were to pull off the shelf a Orthodox Bible, you'd find more or less a similar situation with those apocryphal books looking somewhat different perhaps. Now, if you were to grab a Protestant Bible off the shelf, you would see that it's a little slimmer. It has the Old Testament and the New Testament. All that to say, that kind of short exercise of imagining what that would look like to compare these Bibles, you would see 4 different canons with 4 different lists and 4 different shapes of the biblical text in front of you. Now, the reason for that is because we have different communities and different faith traditions have their own canons, and they developed those canons through different processes. Now, what we want to be aware of today is that that process and that development, that shaping of a canon in any given faith community took some time to develop. If we just focus on the kind of Christian tradition for a moment, the Hebrew Bible that gets adopted into the Christian Bible, plus the New Testament, and then even the early apocryphal writings, that shape of the Bible takes about 4 centuries after the Common Era to be firmed up, to be fixed, to be universally accepted. Now remember, when we're studying the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're in that BCE era, so we're studying an era that's about 500 or 600 years before that fixation takes place, at least for Christian tradition. So that's something you want to be aware of. When we're talking about the term Bible, that signifies some very important and meaningful things for faith traditions today that go back at a very early time. But the great thing about the scrolls is we're actually at a period before all this, so we can open up all sorts of new questions about what do we mean by a biblical text before there was a Bible, if you will. One thing that we might want to exercise some sensitivity to in studying this literature in this period is preferring the term scripture or authoritative literature over the term biblical, simply because the Bible in a book form didn't exist just yet. In this era, of course, we're in a scroll era where users or readers or communities would have experienced biblical books outside of the format of a book or outside of the format of a Bible. That technology hadn't been invented yet. So we want to imagine ourselves in this world and be sensitive to some of the things we find in this world, because some of those ideas that we have about manuscript culture, book culture, and the theological framework of a Bible, those things might not actually work in this time period because we're before some of those major decisions and moves get made. So that's a few things we want to keep in mind about terminology. Is so long as we know that we're in a world where the biblical text is nascent, it's coming together, but it's not quite fixed, now we can have some room to play. Now we can have some room to think about what types of biblical texts or scriptural texts would have been circulating. What types of scriptural texts do we want to compare the Dead Sea Scrolls with? What types of scriptural texts do we see differences and similarities with when we sit down and read the biblical scrolls? Here I want to transition into the next part of our session and look at 3 of the major manuscript traditions you just have to know about if you're going to do this sort of comparison. We're going to look at the Masoretic text, we're going to look at the Septuagint, and then we'll look at the Samaritan Pentateuch. And these are all conversation partners that we want to have in mind as we're studying the biblical scrolls. So here we go. We're going to look at Masoretic text first up. Now, as you read for this week, the biblical scrolls are invaluable for a number of reasons. One of them because they are the earliest biblical manuscripts that we have. They're also biblical manuscripts that are in the original languages of the Bible, in the Old Testament, that's Hebrew and Aramaic, and then also some Greek texts that we'll circle back to in a moment. But by the time we see the scrolls, or by the time they're discovered, Scholars already knew about texts like the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint. So what types of profiles can we develop for these traditions before we compare them? The Masoretic text we could say a number of things about, but just a short list of things is that this text family, this text tradition, has its origins in about the 7th century CE, so of the Common Era, up in the region of the Galilee in a place called Tiberias. Now, they're a group of rabbinic scribes that were copying and collecting biblical manuscripts, and this tradition that they collected around them and copied out becomes known as the Masoretic text. Now, how did they copy the text? Well, they did so with great fidelity, with great care and great concern for the words on the page. They added only modest modifications and contributions. Things like they developed a system for vowels, for pronunciation. They clarified minor ambiguities, often through marginal notes. Often that would mean that they did not engage or add something to the text. They would comment outside of the text. They also included things for reading patterns or clarifying things for cantillation or liturgical readings. But all the things we see happen in the Masoretic text, those contributions are more or less made in the margins or outside of the text itself. What we see is a very limited engagement with the text. The text at this point is stable and not to be interfered with. Now, the Masoretic tradition that we have, we think goes back to about 7th century CE, but the Bibles that we have, or the manuscripts we have from this group, date a little bit later, for 300 or 400 years later, and then into the Middle Ages or further still. The most important ones that you see here on the screen before us are the Aleppo Codex, which we'll see in a minute, and the Leningrad Codex. If you're reading any modern English Bible, whether or not you realize it, you're reading much of the Leningrad Codex, called Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, is the form that most translators will use. This is put out by the German Bible Society, and as you can see here, it's a Hebrew Bible. It's based on that 11th century manuscript of the Leningrad Codex, and this is, while it's 11th century, it is the most complete Hebrew Bible around, even more so than the Scrolls, the Septuagint, or the Aleppo Codex. So we can't do anything in biblical studies without this. So the Masoretic tradition has given us a lot, and it is complete, even if it's not our oldest text tradition. So that's the Leningrad Codex. I wanted to show you a few images of the Aleppo Codex. The Aleppo Codex is housed at the Israel Museum, the Shrine of the Book, as we saw a number of other Dead Sea Scrolls were as well. There's a great website that you can go to engage that manuscript yourself. We won't do that here now, but if you click over to aleppocodex.org, you'll be able to see images like the one we see on our screen here before you, and you can search images. You can zoom in, you can zoom out. You can really get a feel for what that manuscript looks like and just a real clear sense of the care that the Masoretes took in copying this beautiful manuscript. So that's the Masoretic text. You've seen what a few things look like. That's a profile, a general kind of profile of where it came from and what it looks like. But we have two other texts we want to consider as well. But before we get to those, I want to show you one other medieval text that is really important to us here at Trinity Western. It's something that we're hopefully going to be doing a lot more with, and I wanted to share that with you in case you haven't had a chance to see this yourself. Because while we're on this topic of medieval manuscripts that are more or less in the Masoretic tradition, we had a generous gift given to us in this past year by Kenneth and Barbara Larson. They were excited to be here on campus and share this gift with us. It's a Torah scroll from the 16th century. This scroll particularly, we think, comes from Morocco. It has 65 panels of prepared calfskin of the entire Torah, the entire Pentateuch, everything from the first word in Genesis to the last word in Deuteronomy. When it rolls out, it's about 31 feet long, and it's a beautiful manuscript to look at. In general form, this manuscript would fall within that tradition of the Masoretic text. So as we can see, we have some major examples like the Leningrad or the Aleppo Codex, but beyond that, we have a number of other Masoretic text traditions and manuscripts like this one here that would fall under that general umbrella of a text that's more or less stable. So that's what I was excited to share with you. If you get a chance to see this, come visit us at Trinity or come stop by the archives or come talk to me about it. This is just a great text to study, and we're hoping to do a lot more of that in the coming years. So if that's the category of the Masoretic text, that's a bit of a blurb for one artifact we have here on campus. What about the others? The other two I want to talk about before we move into text theories is first a look at the Septuagint and then the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Septuagint is a Greek manuscript. Now, why Greek? Because I thought we were dealing with the Hebrew Bible. Well, if you remember our early session on Second Temple period history, one of the major movements and moments and individuals of this period is Alexander the Great. And when he sweeps across the ancient Near East, he leaves Hellenistic culture behind in a number of different ways, not least the Greek language. So what we see happening in and around the 2nd century BCE on is a move to translate the Hebrew Bible from Aramaic and Hebrew into Greek for Jews that are living in and beyond the land of Israel, land of Judea, so they can encounter Scripture in that language in case they are in a place where Hebrew is not spoken, or maybe they speak Greek instead of Hebrew. So what we have here is a testimony to this early ambitious translation project of the entire Hebrew Bible into Greek for Jewish audiences and readers all over the diaspora. Now, again, like the Masoretic text, we have some important codices that reflect this Greek tradition. We have texts like Alexandrinus and Sinaiticus, both are 4th century codices, so early forms of books. To give you a sense of what these look like, here is just an example of a few pages of Codex Sinaiticus. And this, again, is available in another digitization project that's launched 3 or 4 years ago, I believe. So if you click over to codexsinaiticus.org, you'll see pages just like this, but again, with translations, with transcriptions, and you can zoom in and zoom out and explore this manuscript in a way that you would not be able to do unless you went to visit one of the places like the British Library that has portions of it. So the Septuagint includes some of those great early centuries codices, but that term also refers to a larger family, just like the Masoretic text refers to a larger family. So this term Septuagint quite often is the umbrella term for a number of other smaller Greek texts as well, not just complete codices. What you're seeing on the screen here is an example of a few of these smaller Greek texts, and as you can see, they're more fragmentary and they're earlier, but they're important to the history of the Bible and to that early story of the Bible. What you're seeing in the first instance there is a text from Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, a 1st century text of Job, and then below that what you're seeing is a Greek fragment of the Minor Prophets that was actually found at Qumran within the Dead Sea Scrolls. So what we're seeing is that we have a number of texts, general categories, and in one way or another they do touch on the Qumran collection. Here we're seeing that we have Greek texts that show up even at Qumran in these caves. So that's the Masoretic text, that's the Septuagint, that early Greek text. Now we also have one last example of a tradition we want to think about before we turn our attention to explaining these different traditions in theories. I want to develop a preliminary profile of what's called the Samaritan Pentateuch. Now, as its name would suggest, this is a narrower scriptural canon for Samaritans that would hold that Genesis through Deuteronomy are the canon. Their canon does not include everything else in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, but just those texts of the Torah. Now, how do we know about this text? Well, we have a number of manuscripts, we'll see one in a second, that reflect this text form that are later. But the really interesting thing about the Samaritan Pentateuch is that when we read through the Samaritan text, we see that, yes, it's a Hebrew text, it has an early base text, but it also has a theological overlay that's given to the text. So that is to say, when you read through the Samaritan Pentateuch, you find certain ideas or motifs or themes that reflect Samaritan theology that are then blended into the text. So for example, that one that you see on your screen below in the 4th point down has to do with the chosen place and the approved place for worship. In Samaritan tradition, that's Mount Gerizim. It's not the Jerusalem temple. And that key element of Samaritan theology has impacted the text of the Samaritan Pentateuch. So for example, there are a number of texts in the Pentateuch that traditionally would read when you get to the place that God will choose, kind of looking ahead to Jerusalem as that holy city and the temple as a preferred site for worship. What you have in the Samaritan Pentateuch, in fact, is a rephrasing such that it reads that the place that the Lord has chosen, and that's in reference to Mount Gerizim, which is key to Samaritan theology for the place of the revelation of the Ten Commandments and the approved place of worship. Now, there's a few of these telltale ticks of the Samaritan tradition that once we develop a profile of it and understand the theology around it, we can actually read beneath those motifs and those ideas, and below those ideas, what we have is a Hebrew text that is in fact very similar to the Masoretic tradition in details. But what we also see is a form of the Hebrew text that is early, that has some expansions, it has some harmonizations, it has parallels that are brought together. So in a broader scope, there are some differences, some large-scale differences that we don't see in text traditions like the Masoretic text or like the Septuagint. Now we're going to see again that this has some interesting analogies to what we find at Qumran in some biblical texts. But before we get there, I want to show you just one example of what this looks like, what a text in the Samaritan tradition would look like. You can see that the script is a little different than what we saw in the Masoretic tradition. And you can see that this is, again, in a codex. This particular example was on display at the ROM, the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto a few years back. But that is, again, what a Samaritan Pentateuch would look like if you were to flip it open. And you'd see some of those differences, but you would also see a text that has some significant analogies with the other traditions we've looked at so far. So we've looked at that term Bible. We've looked at these broad traditions, these broad categories of traditions, these text families. Now I want to try to think about the theories of explaining these differences, of engaging why it is we don't just have one form of the biblical text in the ancient world, but why we have multiple, 3, 4, even 5 forms of the biblical text, depending on the theory we're going to look at. I want to look at just 3 scholars' works on this. We don't have time to get at everything, but I think the work that's been done by Frank Moore-Cross, Emanuel Tov, and Eugene Ulrich reflects the general state of play or the general thought in biblical studies on these matters. Most people, I think, would fall in line with one of these or some variation of one of these theories. So I want to give just the broad strokes outline of each of these scholars' works on these texts that we've just read about. And we'll also think about now how this relates to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is, after all, our topic that we're concerned about. So Frank Moore-Cross. Let's start off with Frank Moore-Cross. We could capture his theory more or less by calling it a local text theory, Cross's work in this area built on the work of his mentor, William Foxwell Albright. But what Cross did was develop this theory such that he deduced that the texts that we just met, and the scrolls as well, they more or less reflect different geographical areas of the ancient Near East. That is, they're different texts because they came from different places. He deduced that there are 3 text types or 3 text groups associated with one of these regions on the ancient Near Eastern map. So the first one we want to touch on is this Palestinian text type. Cross suggested that some or even most of the Hebrew Bible was written in Palestine, and that most clearly this text type is the one that's under the hood of the Samaritan Pentateuch tradition and its precursor, pre-Samaritan traditions that we'll see in a minute at Qumran, because there are some of those texts that look very much like the Samaritan Pentateuch without those theological elements included and added in. So that's the Palestinian text. The next text he suggested that it was in existence was the Babylonian text type. Now, if you know your Old Testament story, you'll remember that for a time the Jews were in exile in Babylon, and Cross theorized that some of the biblical traditions that collected around this group in exile are the ones that eventually emerged in that Masoretic text tradition. That it took shape in and just after the Babylonian exile. And we see some of those texts show up at Qumran, which we'll see again in a minute. But the place of origin for Cross for this Babylonian text type, that pre-Masoretic text type, is in the exile. The third one that we want to check off our list is this Egyptian text type. Now this last group under Cross's theory, more or less is captured in the Greek Septuagint. Because the Greek Septuagint has a story and a tradition around it that was developed in Alexandria, Cross understood that, well, that probably means that Greek text family that we see, even parts of it showing up at Qumran, started off further in the west in Egypt. So this theory, I think, tries to capture both the diversity of this the biblical traditions at this early time, and it tries to imagine a map behind them. It tries to plot them at a place of origin before they are mobile and they turn up eventually. Some of these texts turn up in the same place at Qumran. I think proponents of this text, and I think Cross himself, would say that all 3 text types are originating in different areas, but they eventually show up in that same vicinity in Judea, whether or not they were brought there or they circulated accidentally. By the common era, what we see at Qumran is, if we follow Cross's thinking, that Babylonian text, that Palestinian text, and that Egyptian text, in some way or another, all show up in these Qumran caves. So there was some mobility that happens. So that's Cross's theory, and the way you can remember that is just by thinking local text and a map behind those manuscripts that we've just described. So up next, I want to talk about this theory that's associated with Emanuel Tov. Now, if we had to kind of just give a catchphrase to this theory, we could call it a textual variety theory. I think Tov's work on textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, as well as the Septuagint and even the Dead Sea Scrolls, has been foundational for any research on this topic that we're looking at today. He's developed his thinking in some different ways in recent years, but I want to try to just capture the essential points of his theory around textual variety and the characterizations of these biblical texts we're talking about here. Tov's theory, I think, tries to also recognize that textual diversity, but he's also sensitive to trying to pay attention to the proximity of the text to one another. That is, do they share details in content, in shape, in form, and how can we map out these texts not on a physical map, but on a statistical map of the qualities that they share with one another. Now, the statistics I'm giving you on this page here below are coming out of a handbook on textual criticism from Emanuel Tov that just came out in a recent edition, so the statistics that you're getting here might be slightly off from that most recent analysis, but the broad sense of this picture remains the same. What Tov proposes is 5 categories. 5 categories of texts, and here he's talking about texts that we find at Qumran. Texts we find at Qumran that eventually give rise to texts like the Samaritan Pentateuch, or the Masoretic text, or the Septuagint. So the 5 text groups he has here very quickly are, the first 3 are pre-Masoretic, pre-Samaritan, and pre-Septuagint. So the pre-Masoretic texts are those texts that we find at Qumran, those Hebrew texts, that have a very, very close resemblance to that later Masoretic text that we find showing up in the 7th, 10th, and then thereafter centuries of the Common Era. What we find at Qumran is that text type of the Masoretic tradition does have a very early heritage, and that heritage is even felt in a very strong and clear way at Qumran. The next pre-type is pre-Samaritan, and what we find here are a number of texts that look very much like the Samaritan Pentateuch. They have those expansions, they have those harmonizations, but what they don't have is that theological overlay that's distinctive to the Samaritan Pentateuch text. Now, what that does for us is a few different things. The first thing is we can say that that text form that the Samaritans adopted actually goes back much earlier. Even if that overlay is later, that theological overlay is later, that text under the hood goes back much earlier, and we can see that and we can feel that at Qumran in a number of important texts. The next pre-type of text is texts that seem to be similar to the Hebrew text that the Septuagint translators would have used. So here we're talking about Hebrew texts that share details in content and phrasing and wording that are only known from those Greek translations. Now this is incredibly important because these details have a way of almost vindicating some of those later Greek texts, that those Greek translators weren't just making things up. They were doing diligence in their work. They were paying attention to the details. And now we have some texts from Qumran that actually show some of those details originate in a Hebrew text, not at the level of translation. So what we see here are, again, some background to those later traditions. According to Tov, all 3 traditions can be felt and perceived in some way in this earlier heritage at Qumran. Now here's 2 more categories where he goes in a bit of a different direction from someone like from Cross that we saw a minute ago. Non-aligned text and text written in Qumran practice. And these 2 have been the most controversial, but the real hallmarks of Tov's theory. This category of non-aligned text, if Tov is interested in statistics and proximity of text and degrees of similarity, when you run the numbers, there are a number of texts that don't seem to fall close in line with the pre-Masoretic or pre-Samaritan or pre-Septuagint texts. There are some texts that have details that are shared with one or more of these traditions. So rather than shoehorn these into one of these categories, Tov tried to rough out a space and saying, well, there are some variety in between some of these texts, and some of these texts don't lend themselves well to a characterization. So this is what he means by non-aligned texts. And as you can see, a number of those texts at Qumran are fluid in that way and fall under that category. Now, last but not least, there are these texts written in so-called Qumran practice. When Tov looked at the text of Qumran, he categorized those, or theorized those first 4 categories, but he also observed that there are some texts that their scribal practice, the way they're written down and copied, looks a little peculiar to him, and he theorized that the reason why is that these biblical texts fall in line with a group of writings, a biblical group of writings that were actually copied at Qumran, at that community. He reached this on the basis of things like peculiar spelling, on peculiar word formations, or the ways that scribes would correct or engage the biblical text. When he mapped out some of those things and in great detail, he came to the conclusion that it was most likely that there's a large category of texts that seem to be biblical texts written at the Qumran site. So that's Tov, and again, we can remember that by thinking textual variety and his 5 categories. We have those pre-categories, Masoretic, Samaritan, Septuagint, those non-aligned texts, and then Qumran practice texts. So last but not least, I want to share the final theory with you here, and this is developed by Professor Eugene Ulrich. And if you want to remember what his theory is all about, we can just remember literary additions. Literary additions is really the hallmark of what characterizes this theory. Now, Ulrich's theory is based on an interest that we have, an observation as well, that we have multiple forms of biblical books represented at Qumran and circulating elsewhere in ancient Judaism, as we know from things like the Septuagint. Now, broadly speaking, Ulrich, I think, was less interested in giving us a typology or a classification of which boxes we could put these biblical texts into. Then he wasn't noticing that the composition of some biblical books, or most biblical books, took place in stages, and it involved the participation of scribes along the way. So as such, he noted that we have a surprising number of books that reflect different stages, perhaps, of that compositional nature, even at Qumran. So for example, we have the book of Psalms that has a number of different forms and shapes to it at Qumran. There are significant differences in shape, content, scope, and all of those differences Ulrich theorized to say, well, we have editions of books. Not just one form of a book, but editions that might have differences in content, detail, length, etc. Now, when we turn our eyes to look at how this works out of Qumran, what we don't find are, like you would have today, a 3rd edition or a 4th edition that supplants an earlier one. I think Ulrich suggested that could happen, where a scribe could produce a new edition with the hope that the old edition would just disappear and not be in use anymore. But I think what we see happen at Qumran, and Ulrich emphasized, that wasn't always the case. The 2nd edition didn't always replace the 1st edition. The 3rd edition didn't always replace the 2nd. So when we look at this collection, we have concurrent editions that look a little bit different one from the next. Now, you can multiply this number even greater when we look at the Masoretic and the Samaritan, the Septuagint text, because there again we at times have different editions. So here again, what we have is a scholar who's trying to account for as much evidence as possible and pay attention to the sensitivities and nuances of the evidence here before us. I think Ulrich's theory accounts for this in a way that is responsible and respectful of the nature of these biblical manuscripts. What I find attractive about this, it's a healthy reminder that in our modern world, we're often fixated on one form of the biblical text, but that fixation and that commitment to just one form doesn't actually work as much in this period that we find in the Second Temple era. I think what Ulrich emphasizes is that it's the authoritative message of a book that could be communicated in more than one edition than it is just about the words on a page, which is quite often our question today. So what we've heard here, I think, are very brief introductions to 3 text theories. We've heard about cross and local texts. We've heard a little bit about Tov and textual variety. And then we heard a little bit about Ulrich's theory of literary additions. Now, I was happy to kind of give you a short and sweet tour through those because I know for our readings this week in our textbook, you had descriptions of these and other theories. So that's kind of just a refresher, but to emphasize some of the main points, the main lines of thought that are going on around these texts and around these traditions in current biblical scholarship. So that's theories. We've talked theories, we've talked terminology, but can we now root ourselves in the text? I want to try to see if we can't hear some of the benefits of each one of those theories, at least, or some of the things we heard in those theories in text from Qumran, in biblical text. I want to look at just 3 short examples, because today I think what we'll see is they all have problems, those theories, but they all have prospects. So I'll leave it up to you to kind of see which one you fall in line with or find most appealing. But ideally, you want to marry any one of those theories to the text and do that homework in the text to make sure that those theories work out when you're reading stuff from the scrolls. So here's the big picture. We're not going to look at details. We're going to talk in broad strokes. I want to share, firstly, I want to look at Exodus with you. The manuscript you're looking at on the screen before us is called 4Q Paleo Exodus M. And this is a text from Qumran Cave 4 that dates to sometime in the mid-1st century BCE. Now, as you can see from that sample just below, it's called Paleo-Hebrew because it's written in an archaic form of the Hebrew language. You don't have to know Hebrew to know that that looks a little bit different than the text you would see on the Aleppo Codex or the Leningrad Codex. But what we find in this text is beyond just that particularity in the scribal hand, this text has expansions. It has harmonizations. It has qualities that look a lot like what we see in that Samaritan Pentateuch tradition. But what we don't find here, again, are that items of that theological overlay of things like that preference for Mount Gerizim. We don't find any of that in this text. So again, what this text, for example, at Qumran Cave 4 does for that Samaritan tradition is authenticate its backstory, give it some heritage in an earlier Hebrew form of the text, that Samaritan Pentateuch is a valid tradition to the biblical text, even if we do want to recognize that theological overlay. Here at Qumran, we have something that looks very much like it without that theological overlay. It also shows us that somebody like Ulrich would say, well, here we have an addition of a biblical text. We have an addition of Exodus that had some parallels, some harmonizations, some expansions that looks different from what we find in, for example, from the Septuagint or the Masoretic text tradition. So here we're hearing some of those things that are helpful from those theories that we can now apply to texts in the Qumran collection. Now I want to show us a few manuscripts of Isaiah because this presents a very interesting case for us when we're studying these materials at Qumran. Isaiah was hugely popular among this group at Qumran. We find no less than 22 manuscripts of Isaiah and a number of Isaiah commentaries at Qumran. The most important ones I think we've met already. If you remember in one of our earlier sessions, we looked at that online collection of the Shrine of the Book and we clicked through that big, large manuscript of 1Q Isaiah A. What we saw in there was it was somewhat of a free manuscript. There was some rather surprising additions, omissions, scribal insertions, and we saw that that was at once our most extensive manuscript, but there were some issues in it as well. Now, alongside of this Cave 1 manuscript that we see in the bottom of the screen were fragments of another Isaiah scroll, Isaiah B, which you're seeing just next to me on the screen here in that large fragment. Now, 1Q Isaiah B tells a little bit of a different story. What we find in 1Q Isaiah B is a text that matches up very closely, almost identically, to the Isaiah text that we find in the Masoretic tradition. So this is a helpful reminder that the predominant form in Isaiah that shows up in the Masoretic text tradition was copied very faithfully down through the ages. That when we look at Qumran in Isaiah B, for example, and we look at the Leningrad Codex, what we find are two forms of Isaiah that are very similar. So those Masoretes were doing their job, as were the scribes before them, in maintaining a text with great care and great fidelity. But it's also a reminder that when we look at the situation at Qumran, we have different versions, maybe not additions, but very different versions of the book of Isaiah. And what we don't see at Qumran is a preference, it seems, for one or the other. We see them both existing alongside of one another, even settling down in the same cave. So I think this case study in Isaiah is a helpful reminder that there's some merits to each of these theories about fixed texts, but also fluid texts, but those texts existing alongside of each other at Qumran. So that's Exodus, that's Isaiah. I want to talk about one last example that perhaps is even more complicated, and that's the book of Jeremiah. I want to show you just one manuscript, but there are at least 4 manuscripts we want to talk about in this conversation if we're going to look at Jeremiah. Because what we see is we have present at Qumran 2 clear editions, like Ulrich's terms, editions of the book of Jeremiah, and they both date around to about the 2nd century BCE. So 2 editions showing up around the same time in the same collection. Well, first off, what we have is 2 texts, 4Q Jeremiah B and 4Q Jeremiah D. Now, these texts reflect a Hebrew version of the text that looks somewhat like the Old Greek form of the Septuagint book of Jeremiah. Now, interestingly enough, that Septuagint text and these 2 manuscripts of Jeremiah are about 13% shorter than the text we find in the Masoretic text. So it's a shorter form of the book of Jeremiah. Now, if you remember what we said about the value of these pre-Septuagint texts, is that now we can say at Qumran, well, those Greek translators weren't missing something. They didn't cut the text short. They were likely translating a text that looked something like one of these manuscripts Jeremiah B or Jeremiah D that we know existed in the 2nd century BCE at Qumran. But there's more to the story because there are other Jeremiah manuscripts at Qumran we're going to look at, like the one you have on the screen before you here. This is an example of a fragment of 4Q Jeremiah A. Now, if we look at 4Q Jeremiah A and 4Q Jeremiah C, what we find is a text form that is that longer text form that looks, again, very much like Jeremiah in the Masoretic text tradition. So here again, we have some insight from the scrolls into that diversity of the Qumran library, and a reminder that, again, while we're fixated on which is the one text, that question doesn't seem to be as much of an issue at Qumran, where we're living in a scribal culture where there are variations and differences in manuscripts. Again, this example in Jeremiah is helpful, especially for Septuagint, and we're starting to see how these texts at Qumran are invaluable in and of themselves, but they also speak a lot of information into those other later text traditions, like the Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and the Septuagint. So that's a few examples, but how do you flag some of those examples? We could sit here together, and this might be fun for me, but maybe not so much for you, to collate differences, develop lists of variant readings of differences between manuscripts among the scrolls, then between these other traditions. But thankfully, a lot of scholars have done a lot of that work for us. And I want to show you how you can even access this in translation in case you don't have Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic to work in the original text yourselves. Now, this is one of the textbooks for our course, and you read stretches of this for this week, but I want to show you what I love about this resource and one way that it can help you in your reading and research for this next stretch of the course. Because what you find here in this text is a translation of the biblical scrolls, but what you also have are comments from the translators, our modern translators, the editors of this book. As you see on this screen here, this is an example of a few passages from Joshua 4 and 5. Now, about a third of the way down the screen, you're getting that italicized text. And what that's giving us is a very short description of here's how the following text from Qumran is similar or different in kind of the broad strokes from texts like the Masoretic text or the Samaritan Pentateuch or the Septuagint. So that's kind of big picture level stuff. But if you look down the footnotes, what you're seeing there are items where the translators of this text are saying, here's the details that matter. Here's the differences in words or phrasing that we find when we compare Joshua to the Masoretic text or the Septuagint. So this is a hugely helpful resource. This week we did read some of it. I would encourage you to keep looking at this, keep a thumb in this, because this is something that is a valuable resource for getting at all of these texts in translation and really getting a sense of the differences and how they match up or where they conflict with one another. So that's a few texts. That's a resource that we know and should be using. But that is really what I wanted to get at for our session on this scope and shape of Scripture. As always, we could have done so much more. I think we had some help from our textbook this week to contextualize it, and we can continue the conversation into this next session as well. But what I hope we saw, that while the Bible, that book that we know and read today, technically didn't exist in that format in that period in the Second Temple of Judaism, what we find is that it has a very rich and meaningful heritage. That those books, those soon-to-be biblical books, actually have a deep story that goes back very early on. And we can track some of the genetics of these biblical manuscripts, see where they came from, and see how their text forms go back very early, but also see how they developed. So for me, the scrolls are a great way of confirming some of those contemporary thoughts about the biblical text. And they also challenge us to rethink some things, which I think is always healthy. So I hope we've done a little bit of that today. In the end, I hope that we've arrived at a more informed understanding of this kind of biography of the Bible, even though we've just touched on the high points, that this book that many readers have today is their canon of Scripture in communities as authoritative or inspired or useful for teaching in life, that this is not a new book. This is a book that has been in the hands of communities and readers for thousands of years. So next up, in our session that follows this one, we're going to look at something that's as old as the text of the Bible itself. I want to look at the project of biblical interpretation, because one thing we find at Qumran is that the biblical text has very, very early roots, but as early as the biblical text perhaps is this enterprise and act and interest in interpreting the text of the Bible. So that's about what we needed to work on for today. I hope that was helpful for contextualizing your readings, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time for our talk on biblical interpretation. Thanks for being here.